Hello everyone. So in this video we are going to go over the making of the actual faction. So in the previous videos we set up, well, the first video we did was setting up, and then the one afterwards we went about actually making the faction traits, but we never actually made our faction yet. And today we are actually going to start making our faction. So I'm going to try to keep this short, like about 30 minutes, so this might be two different videos. But, yeah, and I am going to go about this a little bit different since, like, unlike with the faction traits where it's very sort of straightforward, in this there's just a bunch of different type of things you really need to actually create your own faction trait. And the first thing I'm going to do is that I am going to change our schema. So I originally was working on a video for this, and at the end of the video I couldn't figure out like why any of the stuff wasn't working, and well, after deleting that video I ended up realizing that it was because the schema was still commented out. So we're going to just uncomment this schema stuff, and I'll get into what each one of these does now. So this remapping definition, later on we will be making remapping as more as in changing the actual mesh or the sort of the design of like different like characters and units. So we need this, that way we can actually like give our units a design and like an actual and mesh and everything like that. I am going to uncomment this stuff out because this is just more GUI elements that I found that are available that we can use. That we can leave. That's just like, that's the GUI for like just sorting stuff. We don't actually need that because we don't do anything with sorting. This right here, similar to with the faction traits, we have all of our constructible elements, so things as in like actual constructible buildings to unit types and making units, all are here. Like we have our unit profile, our unit body definition, all that stuff. Going to open up our science constructibles. So when you have science constructible, that doesn't mean that you're constructing like science buildings. It means that like anything that's a constructible means that like it's something that you can like research or like spend points on, as in like build like a thing or like build a unit or like research a technology. Anything that's like a continuous sort of build up sort of path. I hope that makes sense. But science constructibles, these are all researches. We have our simulation and scripting. Then we have our main thing right here, which is the database for our factions. And without this, we actually can't do anything. Without this database plugin faction, we actually can't do anything. Oh, and if you need all this, if you just there's two ways of how you can get this. You can either go into one of my mods and just copy this, or you can. Or, like, I mean, if there's enough of a demand, I can copy all of this and then just paste this all in the description. But yeah, if there's, like, a lot of comments saying that, like, that's what you guys want, I can go about it that way as a second option. And, yeah. And so everything else I think I've already went over in a previous video. So right now, we have all, or well, almost all, of our schemas up. And we can actually now start coding. So the first thing we are going to do is that we are going to make a new document that we're going to call, that's going to be our faction. So there's two main documents that you're going to need. The first one is that you're going to need a factions document, and that one, what that does is that whenever you have like your not civilization, whenever you have like your major faction, what you're going to have is that you're going to have a bunch of traits, and you could click on and off these traits when you're making your custom faction. And like these are the more minor traits that you can edit, and those it's like the small traits, like for example for the cultists, it's like the ones where it's you not convert a city. Well, convert a city is in that faction's like page, but document, but it's the ones where it's like, oh, you gain like a resource bonus whenever you or well, science bonus whenever you capture a city, things like that. These minor type of faction bonuses and faction traits, that's what goes in the that faction's document. And then the ones that are more bigger, the ones that you don't want to switch out, like for example, you don't want people to switch out units, like that. You don't want them to click on off units. And there's sometimes some traits that you don't want them to click off as well. Those are faction affinity. Affinity in this game is more than what defines the faction itself. So the units are defining the faction themselves. And so we have both of these documents right here, and I'm just going to copy both of them, and I'm going to bring them into our game, our folder right here. So I'm going to go down, and I'm going to shift click and delete all of this. Actually, I'm going to leave one as an example. Let me just find a good one. Okay, so I'm going to just leave in the Mad Fairies right there, and I'm going to shift click and delete all of this right here. So we have our Mad Fairies right here as an example, and if we leave it here, nothing bad is going to happen. And I think I've explained this plenty of times in like my previous videos, but as you can see right here, like for example, the trait living towns, these the fact that like you get these different texts. These are things that when you create your custom faction, you can kind of turn on and off and like switch in and out. But notice how there's some traits that Mad Fairies actually have a lot more traits that aren't listed here. And so those are in, and because those are the traits that define the Mad Fairies, such as units and all that other stuff, those are in the faction affinity. So I'm going to go through this and from top to bottom, and and anything that we need to change, we're going to change. So the first thing right here is that this is going to be the name of our faction. Always at the top, or well, not always, but most of the time at the top is going to be a way of organizing it. So the first thing that we're going to have, which the first way of organizing it, is going to be our name. We're going to give this faction trait's name, and we're going to call this SF faction. Actually, well, we're just going to call this SF for Silica faction. Standard means that like this is a typical faction that we're going to be working on, because if you saw earlier, there were minor factions and this other thing called a lesser faction, and those aren't standard faction. Those are listed as factions in here because they have traits and they kind of in a sense are a faction, but they're not major factions. So anything that's a major faction is here. So we're going to leave this true because it is a major faction. Author, I'm going to just put my first name. And priority means where it is going to go in our the listing. So whenever you start up your game, you're going to see three different rows, not rows, but three different columns, and then like several different rows going down of the various major factions that you have. And the lower you go, the higher up it's going to be on the table. So for example, the Mycara have a really low priority, whereas the Mad Fairies whereas something I think like the Broken Lords have a really high priority. But it could be the opposite way. I could be thinking about it in the opposite way. Let me just double check. So I know that for a fact Mycara are okay. Yeah, so the lower you go, the higher up you are, and the higher you are, the lower down you are. So it's a bit weird. It's a little bit like inversely of what you would expect, but that is what priority is. So we want this to be seen, so we're going to leave this at 400, and then at the very top left, we should be seeing our faction. Then we have our affinity. So there is if we go into our simulation, we should see that there is going to be another thing that will say, I think, affinities or something along those lines. I think simulation descriptor affinities. And basically what these are is that this is just sort of a document that's saying, okay, what affinity are we going to have? Like, because remember how I was saying earlier that we have another document called affinities, which I'll get into after this. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to skip this for now. When I get to my other document, I will show you this. So, affinity mapping, this is sort of what the design is going to look like. So everything from all like the beginning screens and like, I guess in a sense the text dialogue as well. That's all in the affinity mapping. Affinity mapping is all about, well, not text dialogue, but like affinity mapping is all about the images you see from the civilization. So far I don't think I've been able to actually get the design of the actual city itself, but that's probably where it would go in the affinity mapping. And anytime you see something with mapping, that's always the design of a 3D element. And then right here we have our traits. So we can, because we're not, actually, we can just leave, I'm going to leave in the Mad Fairies. Actually, no, I'm going to take that out because we already kind of have that already. So those are just traits that the Mad Fairies have that can be swapped in and out. And I think I've explained this multiple times already, so I don't think you guys are going to get too confused when I mention stuff like that. So we're going to now add some of our traits. So I'm going to go back into our simulation descriptor traits right here. And the first thing I want to do is that I want to change our heat wave trait to SF heat wave. So that way when we have a trait, the game doesn't accidentally get confused between like a different heat wave trait. So although I don't think that that's going to be possible because I've already play tested this, but just to make sure that there's no confusion, I'm just going to have that as this. So from now on, we're going to call this trait the heat wave, SF heat wave, as I listed right there. And so I'm going to just do one last thing. I'm just going to go into GUI and I'm just going to change the heat wave trait to be SF heat wave trait. And yeah, you can see that like I kind of have like a few of them listed already, but because when I was making my last video, this is what I kind of went over a little bit. But of course, because like I had like some problems in my last one, I had to delete that one. But yeah. Anyways, getting back to getting back to the mod. So we're going to start with our faction trait die, and so we can see from. I'm going to close. Actually, I'm going to bring that over here, and I'm going to just open up the. Actually, no, we already have this on. And so I'm just going to show you, like, so this is an example of how you call in one of these traits. You're going to have it where it's just going to be trait. You're going to have capital name, and then it's going to be equal to a string, which our string is going to be faction trait specific diet. And so this is like anything with like quotation marks in any type of programming, or maybe not specifically quotation marks, but they're going to use a string, which is a word-based variable, which this variable represents our simulation descriptor right here. And so now what we need to do is that, as you can see, we're getting right here a little error, and we're going to need to now close this off. And so that's how we add our traits. So now if we were to start the game, I'm not entirely sure what would necessarily run right now because like we don't have any of our faction trait or faction affinities yet. But anyways, I'm going to just finish off with a couple of these traits. I'm going to do it for my free trait as well right here. So I'm going to call this, so I'm going to copy and paste my free trait. I'm going to I'm going to leave my heat wave out because a heat wave is also another trait that is used to define different factions. And for our last trait, because I think it's in our faction traits custom, we're going to copy our faction trait sharing. And actually what we should be doing is that, actually, well, what we should have, yeah, I'm going to copy that faction trait custom as sharing. I think this will work, but I'm not entirely sure if I could just leave it as is, or, actually, you know what? Just for good practice, what we're going to do is that we're going to bring our faction trait sharing into our simulation descriptors. So the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to make another exact simulation descriptor, except in this case, instead of having it where it is where we have actual defined values and like a whole like path and everything like that, we're instead going to just be calling a simulation descriptor reference. So, for example, what we could just do is that we can, actually, I don't need to do that, we're going to have that, so that way that works. And what we're going to do right now is that we're going to just reference this to our mad faction traits, the sharing. And I'm just going to tab that right there so that way it's a bit organized. And so what we could just do right now is that we can actually replace this with the faction trait free. And what this should do is that since we're calling this simulation descriptor mad fairies trait sharing right here, it's basically like as though we have it right here as well. But the main point about this is that we're also going to be having it in this trait right here because we are going to be referencing that as well. So we're going to, so we can now call our faction trait, what was this called again? It wasn't called free, it was called sharing. So right now, yeah, so we can just leave it as a sharing right there. And so, yeah, this should be good. The next thing we are going to do right now is go into the faction trait affinities. I'm going to move that over here. I'm going to actually close the, actually no, because I'm going to talk about that later. Wait, hold on, I think I'm confusing myself. Oh, okay, I'm going to move that over there, and I'm going to delete the customs. So this is the faction trait affinities, and I'm going to do what I did last document, and I'm going to delete everything except for the broken lords, or to leave them as an example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to place them right here. And I'm just going to call them SF for short. SF for Silica Faction for short. So, right now, we need a faction trait affinity, and this is referencing what our affinity is. And so, remember when I was talking about the faction trait affinity right here, which we're actually going to need this as well. I'm going to just copy this, and I'm going to just paste this in the documents right here. So all of this, what all of this is that it is just saying that, hey, all of these names are classified as affinity, so they are viable to use when talking about the affinities. And although they don't have any sort of like real simulation descriptors with them, there are a couple that do have something with them, but for most of the time you're going to actually just use these. You're going to just leave these blank. So I'm going to delete all these, and basically all we just need to do is just sort of reference our affinity, which we're going to call it SF. And basically what's just saying that our silica faction or affinity SF is an actual affinity. So that way when we go and we work with, for example, in our factions right here, we say, hey, what's our affinity going to be? We can now say, oh, our affinity is actually, oh wait, not that one. Our affinity is actually going to be SF, or stands for silica faction. So then the computer's going to look into affinity, look into the simulation descriptor faction affinity. Does it see something that says affinity SF? Well, now it does, because, and so now it says, okay, this can work, and this is now an actual affinity. And so now so another reference to the and so now when it goes into here, it's sort of like it sort of bounces off both of these. Well, now looking at it a little bit closely, it's more as in the affinity right here doesn't look into here, but it looks into the faction trait affinity right here. It looks to see, okay, what is there an affinity called SF, which now there is. Okay, what's the simulation descriptor reference? And we're going to have this simulation descriptor reference be relating to our affinity SF. So now it goes into here, looks for affinity SF, and says, oh, okay, so this is our affinity. And so that's what this calls in. This calls in our affinity right here. So that was a little bit of a somewhat rant, I guess. But anyways, so yeah, I'm gonna now just continue just going top down again. So our major faction affinity right here, this is just saying, so we have our name, we have ours, this is just saying that this is a major faction, and that all of these deal with the major faction affinity. And typically we leave this hidden so that way it doesn't really show anything odd, because again, whenever you're picking a major faction, they're all going to just say major faction affinity. It's not like as though you're going to pick a minor faction. So they leave that false, and the cost is the trait points, that the maximum trait points you can have for this type of faction. And I'm 99% sure that that's what it is, because this is 80 and every single other major faction is 80. But we can test this by just changing this to 90, and then when we I guess in a sense go into our game and then click on the whole add new major faction thing, we can test to see, okay, is the maximum 80 or 90? And so that's how all that works. And then right here we have again the affinity mapping. And then we have the personality, and then this is where this is the personality of the major faction itself. So everything, so this is mostly dealing with AI and how they respond to certain actions that you do. I'm not going to really change this much, because I don't want to really delve too much into the AI of it, because most of these major faction mods should be played should be played as a human player, because there are some traits and some skills that are involved that the AI can't really think of, and it's a lot better just to have it as a human player. But if you want to, this is what you would do to change your player's AI. So if you want this to act more like the cultists, you would change this to personality affinity cultists. This is where you have the quests and all this stuff. So the quest for the Broken Lords won't actually go through, because we're not going to give any of them the Broken Lords traits. So I'm going to just comment this quest out, because we actually, oh, oops, wrong thing. I'm going to just comment this quest out, because this will only just cause a little bit more problems. This right here, this is just saying that this that this is a major faction. So this is just sort of just something that says that hey, this is a major faction. And then right here we have our traits that really define the Broken Lord. So for example, this right here is the Broken Lord's whole thing with the dust. This is the heat wave that they have. You can't swap out the heat wave for any type of character. These are the units. You can't just swap out the units. And then you have the integration descriptor. I was playing around with the integration descriptor for my Kazanji faction, and I think the integration descriptor is like the actual buildings and like the whole, and is the affinity mapping for the buildings, but I am not 100% sure, so I wouldn't really change anything much with the integration descriptor, but I don't remember too much when I played around with the integration descriptor. And then right here, actually I'm going to just change these for now. So we're going to have our faction trait right here be the faction trait SF specific trait. So we're just going to replace this with that. Oh wait, oops, wrong thing. We're going to replace the faction trait Broken Lords 2 with that. We're going to change our heat wave from Broken Lords heat wave to SF heat wave. So it's going to be our heat wave. I'm just going to take those out. And then, for now, I'm going to leave in the Broken Lords units because we don't have any units of our own. But later on, when we start working on making our own units, we're going to add these into here. And I'm going to leave the integration descriptor right now because I don't want to really mess with anything too much. But you could take this out and it'll be fine. Except it's just that like anytime you start your city, it will be the Broken Lords, because the Broken Lords is always a default integration descriptor. I know that. And then right here you have commands. So commands are what they imply. They are commands that sort of add in something. So, and they only add in a one-time thing. So, for example, right now we want to create an army one time. We want to have 50 money or 50 dust one time. You don't want, like, for example, like when you're starting out, you don't want plus 50 dust like as a trait. Although, like, I mean, maybe you would want that, but when starting out, you don't really want to give like such an overwhelming advantage. So that's how all of these units are assigned. And so whenever you start your game and you have your settlers, your infantry, and all this other stuff, this is what it's actually doing. It's just saying that, hey, create this army, and it's going to have all these units in the army. There's another type of command you can do, which is called create unit, which it creates a single unit. But I recommend that for this, at least, you'd use create army. And so later on, we will also be changing this. Well, where we will be changing, I think, the hero and our settler, infantry, and that stuff. For now, we're also going to leave in the Empire Mining being 50. But yeah, also, just be wary that using command, I tried this before, but using command for simulation descriptors doesn't usually work. Simulation descriptors and commands don't go well together. You can use commands on anything but simulation descriptors. So yeah, so now we have our faction trait affinity, and it's getting close to 30 minutes. So I'm going to end the video off, but right now, if we were to start the game, I think our mod would run, and we would be able to get our faction. For anything, I'm actually just going to load it up real quick and just see if like it would actually start up. But yeah, other than that, this is how you actually go about making your faction. And in the next video, we will be tweaking a couple more things and just sort of finalizing, making sure that like we have our faction all ready. Because I think because we also have to. Well, we also left out another whole file, which is the GUIs. We don't have anything without GUIs, so we don't have a name for our empire or anything like that. But our faction will load. Well, our faction should validate as long as we don't have any syntax errors, but it may not load into the actual new screen. And so if I go into here, we will see so we have our Silix faction. I also changed the name to Silix faction as well, so that way it's just a little bit easier than just having both of the Kazanji factions. and we can see that our guy, well, okay, I think I messed up, 400, yeah, I don't know why, but I changed it to, he's going to be at the bottom right, but as you can see, we have our faction right here, and so if we're going to add, we can also see that that 80 thing right there, that was all about the, what's it called, that was all about the maximum points you can have, and these traits that we have right here, these are things you can't swap out, but everything else we can actually go and swap out. So that's the affinity, so that's the mod, so that's the Silix mod. And yeah, next video we'll go into GUIs and fix up a little bit more of the simulation descriptions. If you guys like this video, please leave a like and subscribe and share it with anyone who you think might also be interested. The more people that mod in the Endless Legend community, the more the better I guess the modded community will be. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this, well, I guess I said it already, but yeah, see you next video.